There's something quite satisfying about realizing that a jazz album didn't come out of 1965. Don't get me wrong, I love the classics just as much as anyone. I could happily spend an entire evening listening to Blue Note records from the 50s and 60s and never get bored. But every now and then it's worth stepping back and remembering that jazz didn't stop evolving after the golden age. There are musicians out there right now making brilliant records, experimenting with sound, blending genres, and pushing things forward in their own way. And actually, February turned out to be a pretty strong month for new jazz releases. So rather than digging into the archives this time, I thought we'd take a look at 5 albums that came out during February 2026 that I've really been enjoying. Some of them lean more towards modern, straight-ahead jazz. Others stretch out into different territories. But they all have something interesting to say musically. Let's get into it. The first album I want to talk about is by trumpeter Jeremy Pelt, and this one is named Our Community Will Not Be Erased, and it was released on the 27th of February. Jeremy Pelt has been one of the more consistently strong trumpet voices in modern jazz for quite a while now. And on this record, he's surrounded himself with a brilliant group of musicians. You've got Orrin Evans on piano, Buster Williams on bass, Lenny White on drums, and Lass Corson on keys. Right away you can hear that this album sits in an interesting space. It definitely has that foundation of straight-ahead jazz, but it has modern textures running throughout it, particularly with the keyboards and some of the atmospheric production choices. One track that really stood out to me was Manifesto. It opens with these really strong acoustic piano chords that really set the tone. And when Pelt comes in on the trumpet, there's this sense of confidence and clarity in the way he phrases his lines. His soloing here feels very controlled and sophisticated. Nothing flashy for the sake of it, just beautifully shaped musical ideas. Meanwhile, the rhythm section is incredibly alive underneath it all. Lenny White's drumming is busy and energetic without ever becoming overwhelming. And Buster Williams does what he always does so well, providing this incredibly solid musical foundation that holds everything together. Another track worth mentioning is Fathers and Sons. This one moves into a much more atmospheric territory. It has a slightly dreamy, almost mysterious quality to it, helped along by the subtle use of synthesizer pads in the background. The whole track has this floating, reflective mood. Pelt approaches it very differently from Manifesto, playing in a much gentler and restrained way, really leaning into the space of the music rather than filling every moment. It's the kind of track that almost puts you into a relaxed trance when you listen to it. Overall, this is a really strong album. Thoughtful, modern, but still deeply rooted in jazz tradition. Definitely worth checking out if you enjoy contemporary trumpet players. Now the next album on the list moves into slightly different territory. This is Deface the Currency by the Messthetics and James Brandon Lewis, which was released on the 20th of February. The Messthetics are an interesting group in their own right. The band is made up of bassist Joe Lally, drummer Brendan Canty, and guitarist Anthony Pirog. Musicians who actually have roots in the punk scene. So when you combine that background with someone like James Brandon Lewis, who's one of the most exciting saxophonists in modern jazz, you end up with something quite unique. This album really sits somewhere between jazz, punk energy and experimental rock. If that sounds like it might be a strange combination, it actually works surprisingly well. One track that immediately caught my attention is 30 Years of Knowing. The opening guitar chords are what pull you in straight away. There's something slightly mysterious about them. They create this feeling of curiosity that makes you want to keep listening. Then gradually, the saxophone and guitar melodies start weaving around each other, almost like a conversation. James Brandon Lewis brings this raw, expressive tone on the saxophone, while Anthony Pirog's guitar adds these textured harmonic layers. The groove underneath is beautifully balanced as well. The bass line quietly anchors the whole piece, while the drums keep everything moving forward without becoming too busy. What I really like about this album is the sense of variety. It never feels predictable. You move from moments that feel quite relaxed and hypnotic into sections that have a much more urgent, almost punk-like intensity. It's one of those albums that keeps your ears engaged the whole way through, which is always a good sign. Next up, we have a new release from one of the most recognizable guitarists in jazz, Pat Metheny. This album is called Side Eye 3 Plus, and it was released on the 27th of February. On this project, Metheny is working with a number of younger musicians, including Chris Fishman on keyboards, Joe Dyson on drums, Daryl Johns on bass, and Brandy Younger on harp, among others. What's interesting about this album is that you can hear Metheny leaning back into that big, expansive sound that is often associated with those classic Pat Metheny group recordings. There are moments where the textures feel quite cinematic. Layered keyboards, warm harmonic movement, and those unmistakable Metheny guitar tones floating above the top. At the same time though, it doesn't feel like he's simply revisiting the past. The presence of younger musicians gives the music a slightly different energy, and you can sense a bit of reinvention happening with that familiar sound. One track I particularly enjoyed is SEO. It opens with these warm organ chords that immediately create this rich sonic atmosphere. The bass and drums lock into a groove underneath, giving the whole track a sense of forward momentum. Chris Fishman's organ solo is full of personality. There's a lot of character in the way he phrases his lines. It feels playful, confident, and very musical. Later, Metheny comes in with his guitar solo, and it's one of those moments where you're reminded just how experienced he is as an improviser. Nothing feels rushed. Every phrase seems to land exactly where it should. Another track worth checking out is the opening piece, In On It. I always think that the first track on an album is incredibly important because it sets the emotional tone of what's to follow, and this one does that very well. It draws you into the sonic world of the record and prepares you for the journey ahead. Now, the fourth album on the list is something quite special. This is Vital Spark, music of Kenny Wheeler by bassist Dave Holland, and this one was released on the 20th of February. The album is essentially a tribute to the late trumpeter and composer Kenny Wheeler, who sadly passed away in 2014. Wheeler's music has always had this very distinctive quality: lyrical, harmonically rich, and often quite emotionally fragile. Dave Holland approaches this material with a lot of care and respect. On this record, he's joined by vocalist Norma Winstone, the London Vocal Project, Nikki Iles on piano, James Madron on drums, and several other fantastic musicians. What makes this album particularly interesting is the way it blends the sound of a traditional jazz ensemble with the texture of a choir. The result is something that feels almost like chamber jazz in places. Intimate, spacious, and beautifully layered. One track that really stood out to me was Will You Walk a Little Faster. This piece has these floating harmonic movements that never seem to fully settle into one place. The chords shift in subtle ways, creating a sense of openness that gives the soloists plenty of space to explore. At the same time, the choir adds this almost atmospheric backdrop, which enhances the emotional emotional weight of the composition. You really hear both the fragility and the strength that defined Kenny Wheeler's writing. It's a thoughtful, reflective album and a respectful tribute to one of jazz's great composers. Finally, the last album I want to talk about today is Circadia by Mammal Hands, which was released on the 27th of February. Mammal Hands have carved out a really interesting space in modern jazz over the last few years. Their music blends contemporary jazz with elements of minimalism, electronic textures, and even folk influences. The group consists of Jordan Smart on saxophone, Nick Smart on piano and synth bass, and Rob Turner, formerly the drummer of Go Go Penguin, on drums and percussion. The track that immediately grabbed my attention was the opening piece, Window to Your World. Right from the start you get this drum and bass inspired rhythm from Rob Turner, which adds a lot of momentum and intensity to the track. It moves at quite a fast pace, but it never feels chaotic. What I find particularly interesting about this piece is the emotional contrast within it. There's something optimistic about the way the melodies unfold, but at the same time there's almost a slight melancholy in the atmosphere. It creates this strange mixture of feelings that encourages a bit of introspection. As the track develops, you start to realize that this album isn't about flashy solos or virtuosic moments. Instead, it's about mood, texture, and gradual musical development. It's the kind of record that invites you to sit with it, listen closely, and let the music take you somewhere mentally. And Mammal Hands do that extremely well here. So those are 5 jazz albums from February 2026 that I've been really enjoying recently. One of the things I really like about this selection is how different they all are. You've got modern trumpet-led jazz, experimental punk-influenced improvisation, a new Pat Metheny project, a beautifully arranged tribute to Kenny Wheeler, and then the atmospheric sound world of Mammal Hands. It's a good reminder that jazz today isn't just one thing. It's a huge spectrum of ideas and influences. If you've come across any new jazz albums recently that you feel deserve more attention, let me know in the comments. I always enjoy discovering new music through your recommendations. If you want to continue hanging out with me here on the channel, I'll pop a video in the corner for you to click on now. Other than that, I'd like to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.